At its core, Mario Kart World is a game about karts, cars, and all the sick nasty tricks you can do in them. But even in this wide open world built for cars, you'll still find a variety of other forms of transportation as well, from boats to planes and even trains. Oh my god! Let's dive into this situation first. If you've ever played Mario Kart World at all, you're probably familiar with these Sunshine Railway trains already. There's even a whole course themed around them in Whistletop Summit, where one of these little choo-choo boys is constantly trying to run you over. But since Mario Kart World is an open world game, the trains don't just exist to act as obstacles on one particular course. Instead, they can be found all around the island. But just where is it that these trains are going to and coming from? To find out, I decided to start following the tracks to see where they would take me. Now in real life, this would be a pretty simple answer. Sooner or later, the trains typically end up at a train depot, where they're stored until needed for service. And if you take a short drive outside of Whistletop Summit, there is actually a train depot with some inactive trains in it. But there's a problem here. You are being lied to by the video game. No matter how long you watch these trains, they will never leave for service. And to add to the mystery, while the trains we're interested in will drive through here, they'll never stop here. They simply pass through and continue in the direction they were already going. This depot is a fake. This entire area exists solely as dress setting for the player as they drive through, like an amusement park adding in fake housing and castles to sell visitors on the illusion of a medieval village. The developers of Mario Kart World have added in a fake train depot to sell the image of a train system to the player. Except, the train system here isn't fake. I mean, just look at that thing go. There's still an actual train driving around. But if it isn't coming from the depot, then just where is it coming from? Now, the cool thing about trains is that they spend most of their time on rails. And so if we follow these rails southeast, we'll eventually run into a train station situated to the south of Peach Beach, and at the gaping mouth of this massive green warp pipe. Now, this whole area is pretty interesting in its own right. On top of the train tunnel, you'll also notice that every minute or so, a car just kind of whips around the beach before continuing on past the train station. Except, there's nothing in the direction this guy came from. So where is it that all these cars are coming from? They just kind of pop into existence if you wait here long enough, it turns out. And this isn't like a render range issue either. If you drive up to the point where they're spawning in, they just stop appearing entirely. It's almost like they tried to hide this spawn from the player, but they still put it in visible range from the only point of interest in the area. Like, what were the developers actually thinking here? You don't even need spawn points for cars like this. Cars will just already spawn all over roads when you're like a mile away, just to make sure they're full when you get within visual range. I don't actually understand what the point of this is. Between these guys popping in and the big gaping hole where the trains are either coming in or out of, this whole area makes me feel like I'm looking at the seam of what is otherwise a very well-polished game. But these magic cars aren't what we're here for today. Let's talk about the warp pipe. If we attempt to follow the tracks any further into the pipe, we'll be spit right back out next to it. So, as far as the player is concerned, this is the end of the line. So naturally, I sat and waited at the station until eventually, a train emerged from the warp pipe and began its journey across the island of Mario Kart World. To be extra thorough, I even waited here for about half an hour to discover not only do trains only ever exit this pipe, firmly establishing this as the beginning of the railway, but they did so every 5 minutes on the dot, and then sat at the train station for exactly 40 seconds, allowing passengers not only to get on, but to get off as well, implying that this isn't the first stop for the train. These passengers had to have gotten on the train somewhere before this. But so long as I can't travel through here, where exactly that is remains a mystery. Perhaps the true start of this railway lies in some far-off overseas land, and this train is simply meant to bring passengers to the island itself. But that's purely speculation, and we don't have time to dwell on it, because now that I know where these trains are coming from, we can finally ride this bad boy to figure out where it's going. First, we went northwest through the Safari and Cheep Cheep Falls, before eventually pulling into Peach's Stadium, where, while we made a brief stop, we also passed by our first train moving in the opposite direction as well. One thing to note as we pull out of the station, though, is that there was only a single rail here which seemed to serve trains going in both directions. Keep that in mind for later. Moving on from Peach's Stadium, we then took a southward turn at this junction before taking another stop near the Chaco Mountains, and then soon after we arrived at Crown City, at which point the train entered a second warp pipe and we were unceremoniously and rudely kicked off the train as it continued under the city. Now, if you've ever been on a train in a city before, you'll know that trains entering tunnels to avoid driving through downtown is pretty common. So this tunnel is actually a pretty cute piece of realistic world building in my eyes. But it's still a problem, because driving above ground around this area to figure out where the line reemerges was a huge pain in the ass that took way too long. But after about 30 or 40 minutes, I was eventually able to find the pipe where the trains were reemerging from, and continue the journey from there. We then visited Whistletop Summit, where I found out a bit of fun train lore. When you're racing on Whistletop Summit, the trains you see on the track aren't just there to act as obstacles. They're actually the same trains coming from Crown City on their way west. Not really sure why they're going up and down a mountain along their way, just to seemingly run over some go-karters, but hey, I'm not complaining. It's actually some pretty fun in-trains entertainment as far as I'm concerned. But we need to move on, because our trip isn't over yet, and neither are my discoveries. Because after continuing east past Desert Hills, I noticed that despite the fact that there were ramps on these trains, clearly indicating that we're meant to be driving on top of them, I don't think the developers actually ever intended for us to sit on top of them, because you can actually rest on top of the gap between the cars and just kind of float there. Now, the obvious gameplay reason for this is that if the developers want the players to drive across the trains and up the ramp, they need to make sure that the gaps in between the train cars are something you can drive on, even if it makes no sense. Sometimes, good game design just requires a little bit of weird bullshit like this to make it all work properly. On the other hand, considering how much effort and detail was put into the game world to make it feel a bit more detailed and lifelike, this does kind of stick out like a sore thumb. Like, what kind of developer would let their character just float there in the air for no reason? Totally immersion breaking. Regardless, while I was bitching to myself internally that Mario Kart wasn't realistic enough, the train kept moving on. We went north past Shy Guy Bazaar and Airship Fortress, before turning east through this rundown industrial park, and along this highway outside of Toad's factory. Then past Boo Stadium before arriving on the final leg of our very long journey around the island. We briefly stopped at a station nearby Starview Peak to let out some more passengers before swinging around south around the outside of DK Pass, where another 3 passengers were then let off the train again. At which point, the train went somewhere else, as I was unceremoniously kicked off the train as it made its exit through this final warp pipe, marking the end of our ride, and finally answering our question as to where these trains are going. Here. They go here, and then leave forever. But remember that train we ran into earlier going the opposite direction? The Peach Beach warp pipe only ever had trains entering the map, and as long as I sat at the DK Pass pipe, I only ever saw trains exiting the map. So, just where was this train heading south going? To find out, I headed back to Peach's Stadium and hopped on the first train I saw heading south. Now, while I wasn't personally paying super close attention during my first trip, as I began to ride the rail south, I did notice that there wasn't any second track for us to take. We immediately hopped on the exact same singular rail that we took north on the way to get here. The Sunshine Railway only uses a single track for all trains in every direction. Now, while this may sound pretty dangerous, single track railways are a thing in real life. In fact, most freight trains in America operate on tracks like this. However, in order to handle multiple trains, single track rails do require things called passing loops, which are exactly what they sound like. Small loops of rail where a train can pull to the side momentarily while another train heading in the opposite direction passes by. If you were paying close attention, you'll already have realized that the stop at Peach's Stadium is in fact already acting as a passing loop, allowing 2 trains to make a stop simultaneously before continuing in opposite directions along the same track. However, outside of Peach's Stadium and the train depots, which are already have most of the tracks clogged up with trains that never move anyway, there are no other passing loops in this game whatsoever. And while I was investigating the track, I also noticed that trains will actually go in both directions along any stretch of track. And yet, despite this, none of these rail joints have any sort of train signals on them to indicate when they're in use. Meaning, if you're going down this track, you have no way of knowing if there's another train on the track ahead of you. And since there's no rail loops, there's nothing you can do if there is. You just kinda gotta believe that it's all gonna work out. Now, there are some alternative rail routes across the map, so as long as you were to carefully schedule all the trains running down every single track, they can, in theory, run down opposing rails without ever running into each other. But doing all this without using any rail signals would require that the trains A, literally never break down and clog the tracks, otherwise the whole system would need to be shut down, and B, that every train is very tightly and safely scheduled to avoid every other train. And as we've already witnessed, safety safety is not a concern of the Sunshine Railways. To make this even more concerning, the train that I took southbound from Peaches Stadium actually took the rail all the way south and became the first train I witnessed exit the map through the Peach Beach warp pipe. And less than 60 seconds later, another train emerged from the pipe heading in the opposite direction. There are no points in this track whatsoever that are one way, and all of these trains have less than a minute to act if something goes wrong. That is not a lot of time. And I've already seen these trains kill 3 people. I kind of had to figure out how to make the toads actually sit on the track reliably to actually get all this footage of them being run over, but it's still the train's fault for not stopping when there's someone on the track. These trains are a goddamn death trap and a disaster waiting to happen. Well, a bigger disaster at least. But what about the boats? The second part of the title. What's going on with those things? Heading north from here into the bay that the Peach Beach is situated upon, I'm just gonna call it Peach Bay for simplicity, we can find a wide variety of boats which we can stock to our heart's content. I decided to start off by following one of these controllable boats that have the words Mario Kart just written on the side, and quickly made a couple of discoveries. First, I always assumed that the Mario Kart text scrolling alongside the boat here was on some transparent LCD display. But if you look closely, there's no glass or plastic here at all. The letters are just kind of floating alongside the boat. And second, this boat is very boring, and that's probably for a very good reason. All this boat would do is just gently circle around this small island outside of Peaches Beach, head north into the bay slightly, and then suddenly turn around back towards Peaches Beach. This whole lap takes only about a minute or two to complete, and it's pretty uneventful. But it makes sense for this particular boat to stay in such a small area. These Mario Kart boats are actually used in gameplay after all. When a player comes to this part of the bay, the developers wanted these boats available for use, so having them sail off in some random direction would probably be pretty poor game design if you think about it. But what about the boats that don't actually serve any explicit gameplay functions? After 3 laps on the Mario Kart boat, I decided to jump ship, check out one of the sailboats, and as you might expect, free from the responsibility of being a drivable vehicle like the Mario Kart boat, this particular ship was not bound to such a small space, and actually sailed up the coast away from Peach Beach. We first sailed past Salty Speedway, before continuing to this bridge and taking a sharp eastward turn, continuing along these rocks that cut off the rest of the bay from Wario Shipyard. Then after sailing away from the coast for a while, we took a sharp southward turn away from the rocks, avoiding the shipyard altogether. Which, I mean, have you seen Wario Shipyard? Despite the name, I don't think you should be bringing any ships there. We then continued south, past these islands and back towards the point we began off the coast of Peach Beach. A pleasant trip, but mostly uneventful all the same. Keyword being mostly. While doing laps around the bay, I did notice a good number of ships passing by in the opposite direction to my left. At first, I thought these boats were just doing the same loop in the opposite direction, and to be fair, they are. But as we were pulling by Salty Speedway, I noticed one ship pulling off a dock and setting sail into the bay, which means these boats sailing around could anchor in port at times. But I wanted to catch one in the act, so I hopped off my current sailboat and onto another one heading in the opposite direction. And sure enough, as we passed by Salty Speedway, they pulled into port, gently running the bow into the cement before coming to a complete stop and just kind of sitting there for a while. No passengers getting on or off like with the trains or anything, they just sat there before heading back out into the bay. I don't really know why they did that, but after a few loops, I did notice that these ships on the outside loop around the bay would actually pull into this port every single chance they got, only failing to do so when there was already another boat there. What was even more interesting to me though, is that I noticed another one of those controllable Mario Kart boats going around the wider bay area with all the sailboats, which was odd to me, because I thought these boats were being kept in a small area so that players could reliably find them. So I decided to hop on one to see if this one was indeed going around the entire bay like the sailboats, or if it was just doing another tiny circle like the one near Peach Beach. And it turns out, all this boat did have a different path from the sailboats. It wasn't just some tiny loop. Its path was even larger than that of the sailboats. It went around the entire bay just like the sailboats, but then did an extra leg along the outside of Peach Beach just like that first Mario Kart boat we followed previously. And on top of that, after riding this boat around a couple of laps, there came a time that while the boat was coming back from the Peach Beach detour, it was on a collision course with another boat. But instead of running into that boat, it slowed down to a halt for a moment before suddenly taking a hard left turn and diverting from its normal course entirely, instead heading directly back towards the sandbar outside of Peach Beach before rejoining its normal route. These boats not only slow down to stop and avoid collisions, but also have an entire backup route in case the situation arises. Now, I have literally no idea why it would ever do this. Slowing down to let the other boat ahead before rejoining the normal route would have been enough, but I do have a hypothesis as to why it's taking this detour. Now, this is strictly speculation, and I have no evidence for this whatsoever. But when you look across the bay, you see boats more or less evenly spread about, rather than just all clumped together in one spot. And visually, this is quite appealing. If you have a nice big bay, you want the whole bay to have some boats floating around in it. You don't want them all in one corner. If the Mario Kart boat kept going along its normal track behind the Banana Boy tour boat, then there would be two boats clumped together on this line. Now, two boats together is no big deal, but what if another boat has to stop for the Banana Boy? Then it gets stuck in line too, and we have three boats, and every time the line of boats gets longer, the more likely it is that another boat will eventually run into the line and get added on to the end of it. Eventually, every single boat going counterclockwise around the bay may get stuck in this one big, super obvious, super ugly line. But by forcing the Mario Kart boat into a second, sharper loop before having him rejoin the big loop around the bay, the developers have created a very clever and natural looking way for this boat to space itself out from the other ones that it was getting too close to. Now, it doesn't actually make any sense from a world building perspective to do this. In fact, it would make more sense if the two boats actually did just stay near each other as they went down the bay. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of the player, it does keep Peach's Bay looking a bit more aesthetically appealing if you're going to be spending a lot of time there. And that pretty much covers everything there is to say about the ocean boats. If you're interested in how the river boats in this game work, it's not entirely dissimilar from the ocean boats, honestly, but it is way funnier to watch the toads do what they do. But Jort's already made a video covering those pretty thoroughly, along with a few other things I missed in my last video too. So rather than having me be repetitive here, check out that video next if you haven't seen it already. And I looked into the planes too, but that human with all the hair clips already said he was going to cover it if he could figure out what the planes lands. And well, I saw one land, and I didn't want to steal the idea. So hey, human, do the planes. But that's it for today. Like, comment, and subscribe for the algorithm. And a very special thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon. Your generosity is as deep as the ocean, and I love you all. Alright, bye bye.